Good evening. Hello, everyone. I can't tell if I've done that the second time. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for the second and final day of our fall 2021 virtual conference, The Road Ahead in Immigration Law, What Can the President Do? I want to begin first by acknowledging that the Center for Immigration Law and Policy at UCLA resides on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. That acknowledgement feels particularly relevant for us today, given that so much of immigration law rests on an assumption about the right to exclude people from the nation's territory. Next, I want to thank our interpreters, Ada, Enrique, Galia, and Sergio. Ellos van a traducir este programa al español. Si quiere oír en español, haga clic en el globo en su pantalla y escojan español. If you have any questions for our panelists during this webinar, and this will be true both for the morning session that we're about to start and the session coming just after lunch, you can use the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. All questions will be sent to us privately, and then the panelists will pick, and the moderator will pick which ones we want to talk about. And we want to stress there are a lot of people registered for these events, and so we can't answer everyone's questions, for which we apologize in advance. We'll also be using the chat feature during this webinar to send out links and messages. You should see a message in there now inviting you to register for the session after this one, which I will be moderating at 12:15 Pacific time. And then a final logistical note, we're recording today's session, and we will be sharing the link with all registrants and attendees by the end of the day today. All right, with the logistical things out of the way, let me just say a few things substantively before we get into this conversation. It's been an intense few months for us here at the Center for Immigration Law and Policy. You may have last seen us in August when we presented a conversation focused on how the Biden administration was shifting the policy landscape for immigrant families seeking asylum at the border. And I'm sure, as many of you would know, the president made more comments about the border and his defense of Title 42 and the MPP program, which I know our panelists will be discussing just in a few minutes. But since then, here at the center, we have continued to focus on several different things. One of them is one of our key priorities, uncovering the history of race discrimination in immigration law. And we've continued to do that both through our support for the fabulous work of federal public defender offices throughout the country who've been challenging the illegal reentry statute, the most prosecuted federal crime in the entire federal criminal system. But we've also been doing it through a separate project, an ongoing deep research project on other provisions of the immigration laws that we hope to complete, at least some portions of it, in the next several months. We've also continued our research on a project I'm personally very, very excited about concerning state and local immigration policy and employment law that we hope to unveil in the spring. Stay tuned for that. I can't help but smile every time I think about that one. Apart from that, like so many of you, we've also been absorbed by the present moment. And the 20th anniversary of 9/11 found us focusing very much on FBI v. Fazaga, an impending Supreme Court case, which I will be arguing in 2 weeks, yikes, and using it to shine a light on the ongoing discrimination that people in our country's Muslim communities face every day, including so often at the hands of the federal government itself, which too often treats people from those communities as though they're sort of perpetually foreign, no matter how long we've been here, no matter how long our families, how deep our connections to this country. We've also been deeply involved in the ongoing legislative process, which I'm sure you'll also hear about in the panels today, including the process in front of the parliamentarian and the various machinations in Congress. We focused in particular on how those processes may affect the 400,000 TPS holders who were targeted by the Trump administration and whose families very much feel impacted and in many cases quite anxious about the process going on in the Senate, even as we speak. Although that is nowhere near all of what we've been up to, I think it's enough and it makes a very good segue to our opening panel. So let me introduce first this morning's moderator, my mentor, my guru, the center's faculty co-director, Hiroshi Motomura. No one knows more about immigration law from the details of its history to the intricacies of the legal doctrine to how it operates on nearly every level, than Professor Motomura. One of the true pleasures of my job is that I get to learn from him every day. Hiroshi, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for a certainly overly generous introduction. That doesn't necessarily manage expectations, but I'll go with it. Thank you. I want to thank everyone in the audience today. First of all, in advance for your patience and attention, because as Aint said, I mean, this is a very tumultuous time. Maybe that's been true for immigration law for some period, but this seems especially so. There's so much going on. And I just want to give a frame here that, this conference is the road ahead in immigration law. What can the president do? ? And so that's why we had a session on Wednesday, the recording of which can be made available with Jorge Ramos interviewing Cristina Jimenez and Laura Prele and Eric Andiola, three leaders of the undocumented student movement. That was on Wednesday. But then after this panel, we're going to have a session with three of the most prominent academic experts on presidential power. But this is a session where we're going to explore what it is that the president can do. Let me start by just introducing panelists with three introductions that can nowhere begin to do justice for everything that they have accomplished and will accomplish. Pablo Alvarado is the first speaker. He's the co-executive director of National Daily Labor Organizing Network, often known as NDLON. He has also, in that capacity, been crucial in building the National TPS Alliance. It's a very powerful political force within the immigrants' rights movement, and did much, maybe really should get credit for stopping the Trump administration's attempts to terminate TPS for 500,000 longtime residents of this country. So in addition to Pablo, we have today Guerline Jozef, who's president of the Haitian Bridge Alliance. And Guerline and President's Bridge and the Haitian Bridge Alliance has done extraordinary work to protect Haitian refugees. And most recently, and quite notably, achieved what's thus far the only successful campaign under the Biden administration to win large-scale administrative relief, to have reauthorized TPS for any group of immigrants distinct from Haiti. And then we have a third leader in efforts to influence the president. Karen Tumlin is founder and director of the Justice Action Center. And the Justice Action Center has played a crucial role in preserving DACA and crafting a response to a landscape that's fair to say has been very turbulent in both in courts, administration, and in legislative activity. So welcome to all three of you. This is what I hope is a conversation more than anything else, really about presidential power. So let me just kind of give you a roadmap of the things that I hope to discuss, even though I realize now that an hour is so little time to get into this. I want to repeat though what Aint said about putting questions in the chat. I'm sorry, in the Q&A, because we will try to get to those as best we can in the last 15 minutes or so. So what I wanted to talk about in terms of, just to give you a kind of a roadmap, I think it's important to talk about TPS and the situation there. I think it's important to talk about DACA and what's going on. I think it's also important to talk about what it takes to achieve change, both in the short term and medium term, and also in the long term. And all this is in the context of what's going on in Congress. And so that's all fair game for what we're going to talk about today. But I actually want to start with something Aint mentioned last night to see if you have any reactions. And by the way, let's keep this conversational, and it's not like we'll all have to weigh in on absolutely everything, but it's sort of what we would do if we were sitting around just sort of talking about this. So last night, there was a CNN town hall with Anderson Cooper. And I won't quote everything that President Biden said, But he said this about the Remain in Mexico program, which forces people to wait outside the country before being allowed to apply for asylum. And Title 42, which is a statute that is 70 years old or so, but it's been invoked by President Trump to essentially largely close the border. He's said the following. I'll just quote one sentence that President Biden said on each of these and see what thoughts you have about this. On MPP, he said, quote, now some of this is lost in transcription, I have to say. But let me just read what's in the transcript. President Biden said the Remain in Mexico policy, which I oppose, the court said I had to maintain it, so we're repealing it. That's one of the reasons we haven't changed it. That's what he said about MPP. On Title 42, he said, it's a Trump policy. We maintained it because of the continued extent of COVID in those countries from which people are coming. It's very, very high. I want to get open this up to sort of any quick reactions you have to President Biden's statements. And the reason is that I'm curious about sort of what this is very much the background against which efforts, for example, to contest or expand TPS are taking place, and the same with DACA. So let me just open it up to any of the three of you who wants to jump in on this.
I can start. This is Guerline Jozef with the Haitian Bridge Alliance. My apologies. I've been having internet issues right now. Where do we begin? So in one hand, they are saying they have to abide by the ruling to do MPP, and at the same time, we all know that the court just told them Title 42 is illegal and they are fighting it. And that is why we walked out on a meeting they were having, because it is unacceptable, and they must be held accountable for the fact that they are willingly ignoring the biting of the previous administration. Title 42 is illegal. MPP cannot be restarted. That's the bottom line. We understand that the previous administration have left a mess, a bottleneck. However, how do we build back from that? They must be able to create a humane way to welcome those people with dignity. So there is no excuse, and I will pass it back to Karen to speak on the legality of things. On one hand, we have to abide by the court on MPP, and on the other hand, we are going to fight, the court on Title 42.
Karen?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, Hiroshi. Also, I have to say, this is my dream panel, being with my sister Guerline, my brother Pablo, and with you, Hiroshi, is a delight. Thank you for having me. I feel really honored to be with the three of you. Listen, no to what the president said, and let me say why. On Remain in Mexico, number one, do not tell me the courts made you do it. You had choices. You had choices on August 13th when the court ruling came down. Failure to act is a choice. And on August the 14th, there should have been an effort, which we're told is coming, to write a new memo to end the MPP program. The failure to do that, and then to say the courts made us stand it back up, no way will we accept that falsehood. We know what it is, and the failure to issue a new memo to end the program was a choice. I have a really clear message to the president and to the vice president. We need you to not be a quitter. We need you to be a champion for dignity and for restoring families. And by saying, oh, we had to, and not writing that new memo, you're being a quitter. President Trump was not a quitter. Stephen Miller was not a quitter. They had a vision, a white supremacist vision. When the courts told President Trump, Your Muslim ban is unlawful. What did he do? He rewrote it, not once, not twice, 3 times until he got it passed. So don't tell me the courts made you do it. Pick up a pen, start writing. It's inexcusable that it's been more than 2 months. You don't get to say you want asylum and that you are going to end Trump policies and then maintain them by your failure to act. So we need you to be dog to bone for restoring asylum. We just can't have the falsehood. Pablo, what would you add?
Well, first of all, thank you for organizing this conversation, and it's a joy to be with all of you here. I am an organizer. I'm not a lawyer, but I do have a team of lawyers in the organization who tell me things to say. You know, I'm going to speak as a Central American in this particular question, because, you know, if they are going to keep Title 42 and MPP, the remaining Mexico policy, which is something that they should not do. But if they are going to use this fortress US logic, at the bare minimum, the president should use the power that Congress has given him and redesignate TPS to all Central Americans living in the United States. But the reason why I think this administration hasn't done it is because I strongly believe that Central Americans have been dehumanized by everyone, by Trump, by the Democrats, and even by the so-called Latinx elites. You know, Central Americans have no voice at the table. Only one mediocre member of Congress who heads the Central American caucus, but she doesn't even include the issue of Central American migration in their conversations. So we don't even get invited onto MSNBC when you see, you know, thousands of people in those caravans arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border. We are, the fact is that we are invisibilized and dehumanized. The suffering of Central Americans doesn't even register on the radar. And as a result, you know, people get belittled, humiliated, stigmatized as animals, criminals, and gang members. So at the very least that this president can do, since we are talking about, administrative relief, what can the president do is redesignate all the Central American countries for TPS, and, you know, the designation of other countries as well, like Guatemala, Cameroon, and others. You know, this should have happened yesterday.
Thank you. I mean, for all your thoughtful comments on what happened last night. And I think this is I think throughout this conversation, it's important to focus on or have in mind the question of who does the administration listen to actually when it makes decisions about immigration. But let me shift gears a little bit here, because we opened by talking about what it is that is going on in the White House in the DHS. But I want to get some sense of the legislative context here. You know, a lot of what we're talking about with TPS and DACA, Congress could step in here. So what's the state of things in Congress? You read in the papers about, parliamentarian, sometimes there's talk of what's some people calling Plan C. I mean, we could have a whole conference on this. I don't really want to do that in this part of this conversation, but I think it's important to set the stage here, because it seems like a lot of what's going on with efforts for administrative relief is against the backdrop of less happening in Congress than some might have hoped. You don't all have to address this, but I'd like to get some sense of, what is going on in Congress, what is happening with the parliamentarian, what do you see happening in the next month or so? This is still an ongoing process, right? Who wants to take that question? Pablo, I mean, we talked about this before, and so, I mean, you've been pretty well up on this. And
well, I'm not an expert in the process of the parliamentarian, but I can share with you what I think what's happening in Congress right now. I think is a reflection of what's happening in society and how immigrants are viewed. Part of the reason why I believe the immigrant rights debate has become so unrecognizably awful is because immigrants are caught in a trap where they either receive scorn from Fox News or pity on MSNBC. And that's when we're lucky in a good day. Absent is the empowered voices of immigrants themselves, totally absent. I don't see it. People speak about us at the table without us. The fact is that what's happening in Congress is a reflection of this reality. And there's so much uncertainty for migrant community because their fate is being discussed in the context of these budget negotiations that not many of us understand fully by what I believe is, by unscrupulous politicians who don't tell us the truth. In my opinion, it's pure political theater where the communities are presented with false choices. A path for, in one hand, they say, a path to citizenship for which the parliamentarian already said no, versus advanced parole. And they don't even know if the parliamentarian is going to say yes.
Right.
And what this is doing is dividing the leaders of migrant advocacy organizations and lobbyists in the Beltway. Mm-hmm. They're being told to choose between what is ideal and what is realistic. And in my opinion, it appears that nothing is going to happen. And so in my view, this process has been designed to end in nothing, to provide a way out for a powerful segment of Democrats who believe that doing something pro-immigrant will undermine their goals in the midterm elections. If nothing happens, they can blame the parliamentarian for the failure, or what's even more evil, they can blame immigrant advocacy leaders for not coming together or not agreeing on anything.
Well, the context for this is that the efforts has been to include some form of legislative relief in the budget reconciliation process, but that requires, or it doesn't require actually, but it calls for an opinion from the parliamentarian who has rejected the inclusion of some of the provisions that have been most far-reaching with regard to legislative relief. And so this is where we are, and there have been several possibilities for legalization that have been rejected by the parliamentarian as being inappropriate for the budget reconciliation process. And so we're down to what's often called Plan C here. Karen or Guerline, you want to? I see you're unmuted, so that.
I just wanted to acknowledge what my dear brother Pablo just mentioned, and the divide and conquer game that is being played, within the movement. And what I say is that the lives of those people are not temporary. They have been essential in the fight against COVID. They are the ones putting food on our table. We have people who are 35 right now. If we were another 35 years, 70 years old without protection. I am standing on behalf of full protection for the people who have been making this country moving forward. And I don't think we can afford another 30 years of people living in fear. I want to make sure that our farm workers, CPS holders, DACA recipients receive full protection and get citizenship that they deserve. And Parliament and Congress cannot continue to play with the lives of people. Vice President Harris must provide and stand on behalf of those vulnerable people. And, again, as Pablo mentioned, there is, do we take whatever we can or go empty-handed? I think we need to push really hard to make sure that people get the full protection that they deserve, and we cannot allow our movement to be divided.
Let me ask this question though, and this is shifting away from the legislative arena where things have not moved along, even though there's some possibility of either the parliamentarian agreeing with some inclusion of a legislative relief, or as Pablo alluded to, democratic leadership acting in spite of the parliamentarians' views, because that's really an advisory opinion. As a matter of tactics, strategy, not sure which it is, does pushing for administrative relief make it easier for Congress to do nothing? I mean, what's the risk there? Do you see a risk?
I mean, I can start. I mean, I think that's it's an age-old question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, the answer is what I've always learned from organizers is we have to do both at once, right? And so, you know, I really reject, like, that question gets asked of DACA all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does the fact that DACA recipients stood up and fought back against President Trump and succeeded in keeping the DACA program in place despite his attempts to end it, did that, you know, take the pressure off of Congress to do the right thing? Like, enough. And I feel like this is what Pablo was saying too. Enough, Congress. Like, we see you. We see that actually when the Build Back Better agenda was presented, there wasn't actually anything on immigration in the first place. And that the immigrants' rights community had to fight back and say, unacceptable, you have to do more. And same thing, you know, we have to say it's both and, because Hiroshi, back to your question, right? Wherever we are with the parliamentarian on Plan C, and I, you know, of course, support the effort to get something tangible for immigrant communities now in statute, because it's a start. But Plan C is nowhere near the dignity, not even close to what is needed. So it's a both and. Let's get some Plan C. And what else are you going to do, President Biden, now to make sure that we are on the path to what is actually dignity? You know, ask a TPSano, ask someone with TPS, ask a DACA recipient. It's what Sister Guerline said. No one wants to live in 18-month or 2-year increments. It's so far below the dignity that those of us who have citizenship enjoy. And until we get to that place for all, then yes, we're going to be asking for executive action. And yes, we're going to ask for congressional action. And we're going to be organizing until we get there.
By the way, could one of you explain Plan C briefly, just so that we're all on the same page on this?
I can give it a start. Others should chime in. Now, none of us, as Pablo said, are in the room, right, negotiating it. None of us know the fine details. But my understanding of where we are now is green cards are not on the table, right? My understanding is that we're looking at something like granting of parole. So a program that is mandatory for a group of people who've been in the United States for 10 years. So it's acknowledging that long-term residents are our people and should have the ability to have protection from deportation and work authorization. So there is also a permission to travel component. But again, you know, that sounds, if you're tracking that, that sounds very much like TPS or very much like DACA, which is temporary. And then I also have an understanding that there are some legal immigration fixes that would allow recapturing of visas. And I'm calling this out because I think it's a big deal, because Plan C doesn't have the dignity we know we want and need, which is green cards. We need to get those visas back that were squandered during the Trump era due to his totally xenophobic programs, right, and bans, and have those for the set of folks, whether they have TPS or DACA, or can get into a new parole program, so that those who have routes through our existing law to adjust status have available green cards and aren't caught up in decades-long waits, keeping them in limbo. But it's not good enough, because we know, and the center, your center, Hiroshi, is focused on this. We know our immigration system is fundamentally racist and does not allow that path to adjustment for a huge set of people, primarily Central Americans and Mexicans. But
So,
Pablo, Guerline, yes.
Probably, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to jump in and just sort of, if I understand this right, then, so, I mean, what we're talking about with Plan C legislatively is something that is actually very much like TPS or DACA, but it would be for more people, but it really would not give more. Yeah. Pablo, go ahead.
Well, I think Karen said it right. I think it's got to be both, but we also have to understand the reality that we are in. Fact is that this Congress is dysfunctional. You know, in one side, I will say you have those who pity immigrants, and on the other side, you have the right-wing extremists who hate us. So there's so much uncertainty in terms of what's going to happen in Congress. But there's one thing that we know with certainty, and that is the power of the pen that the president holds. You know, one of our priorities as an organization is to get the president from the bottom up to do what President Obama did for Dreamers. And I have to give some backgrounds to this. Since the last amnesty in 1986 that gave us employer sanctions, and since the ugly Hoffman plastic decision that I'm sure the lawyers here know 20 years ago, when the Supreme Court said that undocumented workers don't have the same rights as their citizen brothers and sisters. Since then, immigrants have been told to stay quiet when their wages and when their wage and hour rights are being violated or risk deportation. And ever since, you know, employers have had the incentive to hire and exploit immigrant workers. Ever since demagogue politicians blame immigrants for driving down wages and working conditions. So the winners are the predatory employers and unscrupulous politicians. So the president has the power, the opportunity to use the power of his pen and some political will to turn these things around. So he can offer, you know, affirmative whistleblower protections with work authorizations and defer deportation for those immigrant workers who face and confront their fear and face retaliation and come out and abuse, you know, their abusive bosses. Imagine what this will mean for day laborers, for domestic workers, for farm workers, restaurant workers. So the time is now for the president to deliver. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, a memo was issued by DHS. It didn't get much attention in the press, but it did for us because we've been fighting for this for a long time. So far it's just a promise and intent. We need to work to make it a reality. You know, we have to raise its profile. But I think, and we have to do it from the bottom up. So he can definitely do this now if he wants. Equally with the redesignation of TPS, he can do it now. He doesn't. He's got the power that Congress gave him. He doesn't have to wait for anybody.
You know, one thing that and I want to go to Guerline here in just a second on TPS, but one thing that Pablo raises is really yet another thing to keep in mind as part of the big picture, right? You know, we started with what's going on the border with MPP and Title 42. We definitely want to talk about TPS and DACA in the context of Congress, but what Pablo mentions is another important topic, which is what the president can do with regard to prosecutorial discretion and to work in protection of labor rights and civil rights into that system. But let's you know, with having talked about a lot of different background issues so far that are not just background, but they're actually very fundamental. I just want to focus for a few minutes on TPS under Biden. And here are two questions that are, in some sense, are at opposite ends of the current event spectrum, but I think they're worth comparing. And here are the questions. You know, why has redesignating Haiti for TPS been an exceptional success? And why was there so little actually media and public attention to TPS for Venezuela? What is going on, you know, with TPS? I have more questions about that, but that's plenty to start with.
Right now, I feel like we should get a healing on the panel to give some context, with the battle for TPS, but I can briefly touch on the TPS for Haiti, the redesignation of TPS for Haiti that has now allowed close to 150,000 people to apply for TPS. That includes 60,000 already had it, and close to 90,000 people who, for whatever reason, were afraid to apply under Obama because they were afraid, they were not sure what it was. It wasn't really well known within the community. And then people who arrived after the cutoff date for TPS, including some of the asylum seekers who came through this past 5 to 6 years. And I want to make it clear that TPS was not given to Haiti, it was won from the community, from the movement, who pushed really hard to be able to receive that. And we clearly understood that TPS for Haiti, or the lack of attention to TPS for Haiti, is extremely rooted in anti-Black racism. The fact that Haiti is a classic case as to why TPS exists, right? When you look at the assassination of the president, that was a result of extreme violence, extreme political turmoil within the country. And at the same time, the United States was deporting people to Haiti, including pregnant women and children. And then followed that, we really were able to make a case to show that the administration looking at TPS was rooted in anti-Black racism, because at face value, Haiti should have received TPS redesignation for TPS on day one of the Biden administration, day one. And also the fact that we saw it is always easier to prioritize other communities, other issues, understanding that we had to fight a war, literally a war, to win TPS for Haiti. And I know that now we have it. It seems like something that just happened, that was given, but it wasn't given. And we want to make sure that the same tactic, the same relationship that were created in order to win that fight is being used to all of our South and Central American communities, all of our other countries that are literally in need of that protection. It is unacceptable for the Biden administration to not have redesignated TPS for all the countries that are still waiting. So it really took a lot of pushing really hard, and also forward-facing campaigns and pushing and fighting to make sure that we created an environment where the TPS for Haiti wasn't just an immigration issue. It was also a racial justice issue. It is also a social justice issue, because our lives is not one-dimensional. We as immigrants, yes, documented people, TPS holders, people who need protection, are not just immigrants. We are Black, we are women, we are Muslim, we are all the things that we continue to fight to create a better system, a better community for all people. And I think that as we move forward, we can definitely use Haiti as a case study and use the winning of TPS for Haiti as a way we can move forward to identify the different aspects, the different type of protections that are needed for the people. But at the same time, don't forget, during the past 3 weeks, the United States have deported 8,000 Haitians to Haiti. Should I say 8,000 people of Haitian descent to Haiti, and have barred those people from accessing TPS. And we also have to remind folks that it is critical that we push the administration to redesignate another TPS for Haiti in the view of the assassination, the earthquake, and the continued turmoil that is happening in the country as a result, mostly of US policies towards Haiti.
Yeah, I mean, I'll invite Pablo or Karen to weigh in on this general topic, because we have a situation again where a very large number of Venezuelans were benefited from the designation of a TPS for Venezuela. We have ongoing efforts to redesignate El Salvador and Honduras. The question of whether Guatemala is for TPS is an achievable goal. Are they? What's going on with Venezuela? What lessons are to be learned from the Haiti situation beyond what Guerline has already shared with us?
Karen, you want to go? Or
I mean, on TPS, I always defer to you, Pablo.
Well, I mean, I think the best way to achieve change is from the bottom up, and that's what my sister Guerline has done, and what the Haitian community has done. They fought, they, made visible the suffering that the Haitian community has been going through, and they found allies in what I will say in the Black Caucus, because the way which was rightly presented as a racial justice situation, yes, a racial justice issue. We don't, unfortunately, in the case of the Central Americans, as I said, there's only one person from Central American descent who doesn't even talk about immigration in Congress, and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. That's why we are pressuring them right now to take a stronger stand as immigration is discussed during this parliamentary process and beyond, because they've been fully absent. So those who don't know, please, send there's a petition, and we're asking the Hispanic Caucus to be out there and speak out. And what the decision to grant TPS to Venezuela reveals, in my view, is that this is a political decision. And somehow, a segment of Democrats believe that granting TPS to Central Americans will end up in thousands and thousands of people at the US-Mexico border, and that's not going to be useful to them in the midterm elections. So they are afraid of doing the right thing. But at the end of the day, it's a political decision, because when there is a will, there's always a way.
That's the only thing that I would plus is what Pablo just said, right? You asked Hiroshi about Venezuela. You also asked about Guatemala. And what I think is corrosive is granting a temporary protected status should not be political and should not be based on our foreign policy whims and choices, right? And that's unfortunately what we see. You asked the question, is it possible for Guatemala? Like, it's absurd. Of course it is. Of course, Guatemala should be designated for TPS, just like these other countries have been, given the situation in Guatemala. The difference is there political clout, whether it's a Republican or Democratic administration. And that's what's unacceptable, that some countries are in and some countries are not. And the standard varies based on if you have a political champion instead of based on, have you met the standard? Under President Obama, I remember well, I did a meeting with Obama officials asking for TPS for Guatemala, and I was basically laughed out of the room. And that shouldn't be the case. If you look at the standard, it should be the case that Guatemala is designated, just like Cameroon should be designated, just like Haiti, just like El Salvador, just like Venezuela. But that's not what we have.
Well, let me expand the conversation. I mean, I want to continue and get more of your thoughts on TPS and what's going on in the larger context of what the president can do. But I also want to bring into the conversation DACA. deferred action for childhood arrivals. And this is all part of the larger question of sort of exactly, what is shaping administrative relief, both generally and under President Biden in particular. But the administration issued proposed regulations, and the proposed regulations, one way to read them, I think, is that they're very cautiously anticipate court challenges, that they anticipate court challenges, including the Supreme Court. And one of the ways that the administration is trying to insulate, at least the way I look at it, insulate DACA in regulations from court challenges, to separate out work authorization from protection against deportation. In other words, you could get protection against deportation, but it would be a separate process to apply for work permits. So do these proposed regulations, I mean, one specific question is whether these proposed regulations, are they so cautious that they really run a risk that you'll get sort of DACA that's so watered down that it doesn't mean that much? But more generally, I mean, how much in your advocacy do you worry about these things? Do you worry about what the court, do you try to insulate and cautiously write DACA, or cautiously figure out, for example, some parole in place scheme in such a way to anticipate litigation? Or is the Biden administration essentially given in, maybe given up before? I mean, what is really what the risk? And so I think you know what I'm getting at. What are your thoughts on this? And Karen, I mean, you've worked on DACA quite a bit, really over years now, but I want to start with you, but invite other comments on really, how do you think about in your advocacy what courts might do with what you achieve?
Oh, it has been my great joy in life to get to work with undocumented folks and DACA recipients. And where I'll start with this question, Hiroshi, is what I have been taught by DACA recipients, which is, ain't no room for cautious. There would be no DACA if we had started from a cautious place. I cannot talk about DACA without recognizing that DACA was created by the sheer power of undocumented young people who organized and worked until what they were told was impossible was made possible. And now we call it DACA. But you can't just leap into and say, let's talk about DACA. And so if someone, you're asking me a question on DACA, how much are you cautious? How much do you work in? Like, Texas is going to sue you. Well, like, Texas is always going to sue you, but that's not the place that I start. I start by remembering I have the privilege to get to work on DACA because undocumented young people walked across the country, protested until they created DACA when they were told no by Congress. They were told no by President Obama, and they kept going. So whether it's these regulations, of which I am not a fan, or anything else, I believe that as a movement lawyer, it is not my job to begin from a place of how do we protect this against red state attack, but to begin from the places, how do we listen to the DACA organizers who are telling us they want more? And so I want to say one thing about the rulemaking before I pass the floor to Pablo and Guerline on this. Okay, for 4 years of President Trump, DACA recipients and their allies worked our buns off in the courtrooms and outside to do what I say, land the plane, right? 4 years, we did what everyone said was impossible. And we kept the program in place and we landed the plane safely. The plane was, all of DACA was restarted. Advanced parole was back for the first time in 3 years. The ability to apply for first-time DACA was back for the first time in 3 years. And we told the Biden transition team, like, we landed the plane, okay, the whole thing, but understand by the time we landed it, there were like 100 of us on board and there's no engine and we were like flapping our arms, but we landed the plane. We want a Concorde, to be clear, right? We don't just want a plane. And the Biden administration said on day one, we will protect and fortify DACA. That's what they said. And I thought, well, what does that mean? It sounds like fancy milk. It sounds good. And ultimately what it meant was they issued this rulemaking, a notice of proposed comments. And in it, they did what Hiroshi said. They did what to me is unthinkable. They said, instead of listening to you, DACA leaders, who said too many people were excluded. What's with these stupid age caps? What about people who are just a year too old to apply? You have to modernize the program. It's been almost a decade, and the ability to get new people in is going away because of the arbitrary cap of when, at the date when you had to be here. Expand if you want to protect and fortify. They went backwards because they were listening to Texas, to my home state. That will never work. And they did something which for me is unthinkable. They put on the table the idea that you would get not protection from deportation and work authorization, but either or maybe just protection from deportation and not get to work in your chosen profession with that protection of work authorization. That is not listening to DACA recipients at its core, and it's going backwards from the power that the undocumented youth built. And that's what I have a problem with. So that's what I would start. And I know Pablo and Guerline probably have things they want to say on what we've learned from undocumented youth who built the DACA program.
I mean, that, I invite comments on that. And also because what Karen says is really addresses this larger question of, you know, how you think, how the three of you think about achieving change.
You could hear the frustration from my sister Karen's voice, and that is translating what is coming from the community, and the frustration that the administration, President Biden, the vice president, really unable to keep the words and do what needs to be done. In the coward Congress, as Pablo mentioned, you hear the frustration, and we see the pain and we feel the pain. We live in the pain with the undocumented community. And I will say, as a person who has been through the entire system and now is a US citizen, the fear that an undocumented person carries cannot be described. Understanding that you are unable to work, unable to breathe, unable to continue your education, fear of leaving your home, the amount of mental stress and trauma that this system has creating, people having to deal with high blood pressure and heart disease and changing in the very DNA of a person because of the weight of the fear that an undocumented person has to live with on a daily basis. So that is the stress and the frustration that we hear and feel from the community that we are transmitting and translating to the administration and to the public. So it is unacceptable. We cannot go back. We must move forward. And President Biden's idea of building undocumented communities, we don't have space to build back from. We must create a system of protection. And what we say is that saving the soul of America that he ran and we actually believed and we felt for requires and demands that we provide protection for DACA recipients, for TPS, for asylum seekers. That is what we are expecting. That is what was promised. And that is what we must push to get.
If I could add to that, I would say that, and you asked this question, Hiroshi, how does change takes place. And you know, as a long-term organizer, what I've seen is that the most effective change always comes from the bottom up. And that's what the young people did when they were able to get DACA. The campaign offices of the Obama administration were occupied, a lot of civil disobedience. But there was another element as well, and that was that at that time there were more moderate Republicans who, and I remember the role that Marco Rubio played, because Rubio was about to announce the same thing that the president, you know, announced before Rubio did. So now we don't have, it's not the same moment that we have. And my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, and I think Karen can correct me if I'm wrong, is that this president feels that deferring deportation is something that that is within his power and that is not unchallengeable, and that granting work authorization could, in their view, could be more he doesn't necessarily feel that he has a big standing. But I also think that this offers an opportunity, you know, as well, you know, to make the case for the president, for this administration, to stop deportations. You know, the president's so-called Day One bill, for instance, which, by the way, was introduced on day 22. More than a list of principles, is an acknowledgement that there are 11 million people in our country who, despite their contributions, are second-class citizens who lack political, economic, and legal equality. And I want to pause here because I want people to understand what this really means in real terms. You know, the folks that the president refers to in his Day One bill are the ones that for 4 years of the most racist anti-immigrant president in history, and during a terrible pandemic, have been told that they should keep working and dying without rights so that their oppressors can live and work safely. You know, the president in his Day One bill put his name behind the idea that everyone surviving these conditions deserves to be free and equal. But obviously actions speak louder than words, you know. And he has the power to back up his view with concrete actions, but he chooses not to. I know that DACA is a risk because of this, what they are doing. And this is what the lawyers have told me. But I also know that DACA case makes fully clear that the president has the power to defer deportation, even if work authorization is in doubt. So going forward, we have to make the case from the bottom up that the president has the power to stop the deportations, at the very least, or the people that his Day One bill intends to legalize.
You know, thank you for commenting on your thoughts on how change happens. But I want to sort of expand the conversation in a couple of different dimensions now, and I'm going to shift over to posing some questions that came in on the Q&A, but I think very much continue the conversations we have. I mean, some of the questions we've gotten look into the future, and some of the questions we've gotten look more broadly at the present. And so let me start with one and get your thoughts. Anyone who wants to respond, don't all feel you need to respond to every question, but this is the questions in a lot of people's minds, which is the role of climate change in looking at immigration policy. You know, and it's really in the context of, you know, what do you see 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Climate change is one piece of this. There are many other things going on. But yesterday, the White House issued a report on the impact of climate change and migration. It focuses principally on security, foreign aid, and military aid responses. It doesn't talk more than a little bit on refugee resettlement. Thoughts on that? Or is it, maybe it's a rhetorical question?
Go ahead, Karen.
It's on people's minds, and I think it's part of what you know, it's
I'm
an
sure we
area that
all,
people are, it's part of the future, right?
it's part of the now, in my opinion. It's a great question. I love this question. I'm grateful that it was posed. It is an enormous, in my opinion, it's a blind spot that report talks about climate change. It doesn't talk about people on the move because they're forced out. And my one offering is the following: where we have to get to right now, not in the future 10 years, is to understand and to have a different mindset and heart opening to why are people on the move. We have old views that people are on the move because they're traditional refugees, because we have wars that are, the kind of wars of World War II. That's not where we are. That's not where we've been for the longest of time. That definition, if we allow it to be our legal definition of when we accept on a humanitarian basis people in, it's broken. It doesn't acknowledge, for example, what's been happening in Central America for decades. If we accept it as our moral definition, it's also broken. And right now, people are on the move because of climate change. More people will be on the move in the coming decade because of climate change. And we have an obligation, because guess what? We created the climate change, to have a heart opening and a law opening to allow for those folks to enter on a humanitarian basis. That's my offering, and it's not a decade away. I think it's now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'd like to say thank you to Professor Tina Shaw for the question, who has been a leading voice on climate change and migration. And as Karen mentioned, it's not coming tomorrow, it's now. We have internal displacement due to climate change in Louisiana, in Texas, in all across the world. So climate is not coming, climate change has arrived. And how do we respond to that reality? How do we make sure we provide a system that is able to support and bring protection and bring safety to people who are either in the country or around the world? And how do we answer to that? Have to grapple with now, not something we have to prepare for next 2, 4, 5 years. Is something that we should have prepared for 30 years ago. But now that it's here, how are we to those realities? And how are we provide the infrastructure that is needed? How an earthquake followed by, i.e. climate change, how do we respond to the necessity of those people? And as Karen mentioned, when we see people migrating, people moving due to different issues, and now we're talking about climate change, what is prepared for them?
And I don't know much about climate change. I mean, I'm not an expert by any means, but I know this, and this, I had a conversation with my brother, who is an agronomist engineer in El Salvador. He's a teacher and he's also a beekeeper. And he just, him and his entire family just obtained a visa to move to Canada. And when I asked him, why are you going to Canada? I mean, it seems that you're doing well here. And his answer was, it's getting too hot here. And then, I mean, to me, that revealed probably what's coming, that it's not just going to be the most vulnerable members of our societies that will migrate, that they will be a whole different situation that what we're experiencing right now. And all I can tell, all I can say about as an immigrant rights organizer is that we must continue advocating for migrant rights from the angle of love to protect migrants' human rights. That's what I can say, is because the same love that we have for a person who's been in this country for 30 years without documents, we should have the same love for the person who's walking in the desert, or someone in Namibia thinking of migrating to South Africa, or a person from Nicaragua migrating to Costa Rica. To me, this is a humanities issue that we have to approach from the angle of human rights and love for people.
Thank you. And thanks to Tina Schell for that question. Let me pose another question that puts what we've been talking about today into a different dimension of context. This is from Jimena Velasquez Arenas. And I'll just read it. How should we how should we tie the future-facing proposals for immigration reform? How should we tie the future-facing proposals for immigration reform with the battle for critical race theory and affirmative action, narratives of scarcity, sort of the response to tactics of pitting marginalized groups against each other? I mean, I take the question to really try to situate immigrants' rights, immigration law in a larger social justice context. Another big topic.
I can start. I love this one too. I think it's exactly how we should be thinking. I love the part of this question that asks about scarcity and narratives of scarcity, which is another way of saying who should have and who should not have. And if we do what Pablo just said, which is, I think, what we are absolutely called to do, which is to approach immigration from a place of love, then we won't have scarcity questions. If we say, we have love and respect for all people, we won't have this litmus test of who is deserving or who do we have room for. We will make the room for everyone that we need to. So I wanted to talk about that piece. And then the other thing I wanted to say is, yes, we have to talk about immigration within the context of other social justice fights. And particularly, I'm making the case that we have to talk about it within the context of race. Pick any example that you want, but what we saw in Del Rio was not that there was a large group of individuals. The response was driven because there were Black migrants in a large group, and our government had a particularized anti-Black racist response that we know too well, that we saw completely mirroring our history of slavery in this country, right? And the same thing, how was the president able to, with a straight face, stand up and say, oh, I don't like the MPP program, but I have to do it last night in a town hall? Because we are not calling out that maintaining the MPP program, Title 42, is racist specifically against Central Americans. And so I am making the call that we don't talk like wonks and say this is the safe and secure and orderly policies we need, that we call the hard questions, including on progressive leaders, of how their policies continue the racist history of our immigration structure. That's my 2 cents.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think Karen and I probably talk too much because that's exactly what I was going to say, and really look into how the entire system has been built in anti-Black racism, even the immigration prison system. And we can go back into how race has always been the underlying factor with anything that has to do with immigration or the other. We can look at the Chinese exclusion period. You can look at the internment of the Japanese American community, at how they are reacting under the bridge, the fear of Black people. Oh my gosh, Ted Cruz came and did a video and say, we don't have order at the border because President Biden refused to deport Haitians, and they literally responded and deported Haitians. The relationship between Haiti and the United States, the policies that have been used because Haiti there exists, because the fear of Haiti prosper, therefore Blacks in the United States will themselves, fight for their own freedom. And the fact that Haiti itself, the idea of Haiti is a home for all people in search for freedom and liberation, right? And they have fought for that freedom and liberation of all people. From Venezuela to Greece, from the Jews, escaping European extermination, Haiti has always been a beacon of freedom and welcoming for all people. So the very existence of this idea is unacceptable to the West, unacceptable to the United States. Because if Haiti prospers, if Black people in Haiti are able to prosper, therefore we have arrived to the conclusion that all men have been created equal and all people are deserving of life, liberty, in the pursuit of happiness. That people who are other than are too deserving of not surviving but thrive. The freedom of movement, the freedom of being guided by love, as Pablo mentioned, that is how we need to look at migration. Because when we as a body, when we have a headache, we cannot just cut our arms and say, we don't want it anymore, because at the end of the day, we are a community of people deserving to breathe free and deserving of the freedom and of movement. And we also mentioned earlier, the idea of border itself. If you're Ted Cruz and there is panic and there is the storm in Texas, you can get your children and go to Cancun because that border doesn't exist for you. But if you are fleeing persecution and you are Black, you are brown, you are Asian, you are unwanted, you are undeserving, right? So where is the love? How do we approach migration with humanity? I think to go back to Pablo, thank you so much for bringing that, because unless we move back a couple of steps and look at ourselves, and I will say that because when I was under the bridge, when you saw those videos and the pictures, I too was under the bridge, and I was looking in the faces of 10,000 other girlings who were separated by me simply with a chicken wire. So what I saw under the bridge was a reflection of my own being. So unless we are in a space where we can see ourselves in the other and make sure that protection is provided and welcomed, and yes, dismantle a system that has been rooted in slavery, in anti-Black racism, anti-other, anti-unwanted, we will not be able to move forward. I think I moved away from the question, so I apologize for that. But the reality is, unless we are guided by those principles, we will continue to see the same issues. And that is why we are calling on President Biden to keep his promises, on Congress to do the right thing and make sure that we get things done, because our community cannot wait for another 10 years. Undocumented farm workers, TPS, who are being on the forefront cannot wait for another 10 years to be free, to be liberated, and to just be.
And if I can add to that.
Yeah, Pablo, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think
We'll wrap up.
that, and thank you for that, Guerline and Karen. I think that we have to resist the legacy of white supremacy. in every way possible. You know, when the slaves were fighting to be free, poor whites were told that if the slaves would get freedom, that their quality of life would diminish. That's exactly what's happening right now. You know, when when native born workers are told that their interests are in direct tension, in direct conflict with the interests of migrant workers, when Black people are told that granting rights to immigrants is taking rights from them. This happens every single day, even in this immigration debate, you know, like giving TPS to some and not to others. And this is essentially the legacy of white supremacy that's in every dimension of our lives. And we have to resist it, and we have to understand it.
Thank you. And I'm afraid we're at the official designated time. If we were actually all in a room, we could continue the conversation out in the hallway. But I guess that isn't to be. But this, you know, this is, as I mentioned, this is such a rich topic, and one that that we could talk about. I mean, in fact, we're actually living this in real time, right? There's so much to say, and I really want to thank the three of you for your wisdom and your insight, and in all these topics, because they're very difficult, and none of these questions that you've asked are easy, and it's in a very difficult political climate. So I'm going to invite folks who are in the audience. First, I want to thank you for your engagement, for your patience. We're going to take a break, but there's going to be, we have another Zoom link for the panel that is essentially the midday panel Pacific time, with three experts on administrative relief and the president's power, really thinking about what is possible, what are the challenges from a legal perspective. And Ahilan will be moderating that discussion. In the chat, you'll find a link to register for that. It's a separate link that you'll need to get for that conversation, but we hope to see you there. But I just want to thank again Pablo, Karen, and Guerline for really an engaging conversation and sharing so much, not just about immigration policy, but about your views on how change occurs in the moment that we're in. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.